1999 American President's Life Portrait series, we feature President Gerald Ford. This program is about 2.5 hours.
Right hand and repeat after me. I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
For a second time in less than a year, political scandal dictated the fate of Gerald R. Ford. In October 1973, President Richard Nixon had appointed him vice president following Spiro Agnew's resignation. On August 9, 1974, the nation again turned to the congenial Ford to restore their faith in government. Leslie Lynch King, Jr. was born on July 14, 1913, in Omaha, Nebraska. Less than a year later, his mother, Dorothy, fearful of her abusive husband, fled with her baby to Grand Rapids, Michigan, to live with her parents. In 1916, Dorothy married Gerald Rudolph Ford, who in turn adopted the future president and made him his namesake. His stepfather's honesty and integrity, Ford later said, made the biggest impact on his life. Ford attended the University of Michigan, where he excelled both in the classroom and on the football field. Following graduation, he turned down contract offers from the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers to work as an assistant coach for football and boxing at Yale University. Ford was elected to the House of Representatives that year, 1948, for the first of 12 consecutive terms, each time with more than 60% of the vote. He and Mrs. Ford moved to a suburb of Washington, D.C., where their 4 children were born over the next 10 years. A sincere and uncomplicated moderate conservative, Ford managed to endear himself across party lines. The nicest thing about Jerry Ford, a colleague later said, is that he just didn't have any enemies. As House Minority Leader, however, Ford criticized the way in which the Johnson administration was handling the Vietnam War. Johnson responded by saying, quote, "He's a nice fellow, but he spent too much time playing football without his helmet." After Ford issued a full pardon for his predecessor, Richard Nixon, his national popularity rating went from 71% to 50%. And although he was the most athletic president since Teddy Roosevelt, he enjoyed swimming, tennis, and began each day with 50 push-ups, the media highlighted Ford's occasional missteps. Mrs. Ford was known for her outspokenness on such controversial issues as the Equal Rights Amendment and abortion. "I like challenges very much," she once said, and she managed to meet most with a sense of humor. Following her mastectomy in 1974, Mrs. Ford sparked a national dialogue about breast cancer. "Maybe," she said, "if I, as First Lady, can talk about it candidly and without embarrassment, many other people would be able to as well." Their daughter Susan filled in as White House hostess during her mother's recovery. The Betty Ford Clinic in Palm Springs, California, opened in 1982 and was born out of Mrs. Ford's own successful struggle with alcoholism and drug dependency. In 1976, Gerald Ford won the Republican nomination for president, beating California Governor Ronald Reagan in a hard-fought primary contest. In one of the closest national races in history, Ford narrowly lost to Jimmy Carter, and the president, who was never elected to the office of vice president and president, became a private citizen for the first time in nearly 3 decades.
For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he has done to heal our land.
Good evening from the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Over the next 2.5 hours, we'll take your questions and comments about the 38th president, our only president who served in that office without having been directly elected president or vice president. Gerald Ford grew up in Grand Rapids, about 140 miles northwest of Detroit, and represented this city and the surrounding district in Congress for 25 years before becoming vice president.
Thank you, Lou.
The last line of your book about Gerald Ford is this: "The abiding truth of the presidency of Gerald Ford is that in this splendid American democracy, this one good man could make such a difference." What difference did he make?
Lou, to answer that question, let's look first at the state of the Union when Nixon left. Number one, you had a catastrophic economic situation. Inflation was up, unemployment was up, interest rates were up. There was a terrible energy crisis. People were getting in fistfights at the filling stations. Number two, the Cold War was in some ways at its peak. Armed American soldiers were facing armed Russian soldiers through much of Europe, each backed up by thousands of nuclear weapons. With the last great dictator, Brezhnev, in office in Moscow. Third, the Vietnam War was still going on, a war that had divided America and stained the hands and reputations of 3 presidents, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. Fourth, the White House had been dishonored, not only by Nixon and Watergate, but also because the office had already been diminished when Lyndon Johnson failed as a world leader. So then look at the situation when Ford left office. The economy was prospering, inflation was down, interest rates were down, unemployment was up, the country was on the verge of prosperity again. Second, the Cold War had not ended, but we were seeing the beginning of the end of the Cold War. And importantly, President Ford in Helsinki had negotiated and signed a treaty against opposition from both Democrats and Republicans that opened the way for democracy in communist Europe. Third, Vietnam had ended, not in the way Ford wanted it to end, but it had ended. When Ford left office, no American in uniform was in harm's way anywhere in the world. And fourth, and finally, by his own honesty, President Ford restored the integrity of the White House. We could believe our president again. You could believe your president was telling the truth. That, Lou, is the difference.
We are here for 2.5 hours this evening in the Gerald R. Ford Museum. We invite your questions and comments about the 38th president. You'll see those numbers on your screen throughout the program. 202-624-1111 if you're in the Eastern or Central time zone. And for the Mountain or Pacific time zone, 202-624-1115. James Cannon is the author of Time and Chance, Gerald Ford's Appointment with History. In the biography vignette we saw at the beginning, and let's start at the beginning, talk briefly about how he was first named Leslie King, but then became Gerald Ford. Explain that.
Gerald Ford's mother married at 19 to her college roommate's brother. Did not know much about him. It was sort of love at first sight. And they went on their honeymoon, and she realized who she had married on their honeymoon. This was an abusive man. They went to Denver, where he was from, and lived at first with her parents. But he was so abusive that she left, went home to her parents, who lived in Illinois. And he came seeking her, persuaded her to come back, promised to do better. She went back, and he was just as bad as ever. And she was about to leave again when she realized she was pregnant. And her parents-in-law, who were very wealthy, was one of her father-in-law was one of the wealthiest men in the West. He owned a stagecoach line, part of a railroad, and a big wool business. The parents-in-law persuaded her to stay and have the baby, which she did. But no sooner had she had the child in their home, in their mansion in Omaha, than Leslie King started abusing her again. So she took this 16-day-old baby. In fact, he threatened her with a butcher knife, threatened to kill both of them. And with the help of her nurse, she wrapped the 16-day-old baby in a blanket and went out, found a cab, and found a carriage, rather, and escaped across the river to Council Bluffs, Iowa, where her parents were waiting for her. And they took her to first to Illinois and then to Grand Rapids, where he had property. And the divorce came a few months later. Divorce was rare then, and that's why she didn't go back to her hometown in Illinois. It was rare and generally quite embarrassing. The court quickly awarded her the divorce and custody and child support, but her husband, although he was quite wealthy, never paid a dime.
Eventually, they made their way to Grand Rapids.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
She married Gerald Ford Sr.
About 2 years later, she first met him at a church social here in Grand Rapids, a few blocks away from here. And and Gerald Ford Sr. was everything her first husband was not. He was a kind, gentle, thoughtful person, worked hard, and they quickly, they went together about a year, I think, before they were then married in that same church. And this young child, who was then about 2.5 years old, grew up. He was called Junior for Junior Leslie King. He was still called Junior, and everybody assumed he was Gerald Ford Jr., and he grew up thinking that Gerald Ford was his true father. He never, in childhood, he never saw his true father or knew much about him.
We'll find out more about that after a few calls. Springfield, New Jersey. Good evening.
Hi, my name is Pamela Bookbinder, and I'm calling from Springfield, New Jersey. And I was wondering what you thought made Richard Nixon select Gerald Ford as his vice president. Isn't it true that Ford never sponsored a bill that passed both the House and the Senate during all the time he was in Congress?
Thanks for the call.
I don't know about sponsoring the bill, but I will tell you why that Nixon picked Gerald Ford. He picked Gerald Ford because that was his only choice. He had, Nixon originally wanted John Connally, but John Connally had just turned Republican, and the Democrats and Republicans on the Hill made it plain to Nixon that they would not confirm John Connally for vice president. Nixon had enough problems without picking another fight with Congress. So what Nixon did was invite Mike Mansfield and Speaker Carl Albert. Mike Mansfield was Senate Majority Leader, and Speaker Carl Albert down to the White House more or less as a courtesy to say, well, do you have any suggestions? And they did have a suggestion. They told Nixon that the one person he could get confirmed and confirmed quickly was Gerald Ford. And once Nixon had put himself in that position, he had no choice but to select Ford. And in fact, he had been considering him already. He had considered Connally, then that was rejected. He considered Ford, and he also considered Nelson Rockefeller and Ronald Reagan, but he thought that Rockefeller would have too much opposition from the right and Reagan would have too much opposition for the left, and that he picked Ford because Ford was the person who could be confirmed. In effect, the congressional leaders, the Democratic leaders of Congress, picked Ford because they knew they wanted an honest man in there after Agnew, and they felt also that when they picked Ford, they were picking the next president. They felt that Nixon could not stand the Watergate.
We'll take another call and then meet the director of the museum here, but first Santa Rosa, California.
Yeah, hi, this is Michael calling. And I'm calling to say that I think that Gerald Ford was one of the greatest presidents we've had in the 20th century, and the fact that he was there in parts of history during the Warren Commission, finding out information about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which was today, happens to mark that anniversary, and as well as cleaning up Watergate and cleaning up Vietnam. And people criticize him for pardoning Nixon, but he also gave amnesty to the draft dodgers to try to heal the differences in this country. And at the same time, he tried to help the economy, and in a very short time, he did a lot of great things for this country. And he was a very good president. And I think that people just didn't really appreciate the things that he had done in this country. He never asked for the job. He did an honorable job. He did restore honor to this country, and he's one of the greatest presidents. And also, they tried to assassinate him several times, and he had to go through that. And along with that, I also wanted to know if you had any information that was the CIA using the Gerald Ford double during the time that they were trying to assassinate him, and they put in the Gerald Ford double, a Secret Service agent, because there were so many assassination attempts on his life.
Thanks, California.
No, I don't think there was ever a double for him. There was a Secret Service agent who was on his detail who looked a lot like him, and sometimes people did mistake him one for the other, but there was never a double used.
One of the people who's been quite helpful in us being here these several days getting ready for this program is Richard Norton-Smith. He's director of the Gerald Ford Museum. Good evening.
Good evening, Lou.
Tell us where you are in the museum.
We are in the Ford Paint and Varnish Company, actually a recreation of a business that was started by Gerald Ford Sr. just a few weeks before the Wall Street crash of 1929. And in the course of the Depression that followed, the Fords lost their home, had to move into a less posh neighborhood, if you will, in Grand Rapids. But Mr. Ford Sr. was determined that none of his employees were going to lose their jobs, and they didn't. And that fact alone tells you something about Ford family values. So when we were redesigning this museum 2.5 years ago, and we wanted to create an environment in which to tell the biographical portion of our story, we thought that the Paint and Varnish Company would do the job just fine.
That last caller suggested that Gerald Ford was involved in a number of significant events in relatively recent history, which is something you and I spoke about yesterday.
That's right. It is amazing when you stop to think. This man went to Yale, where he joined America first. He went to World War II, and he had a road to Damascus experience like his hero, Arthur Vandenberg, who, of course, was also from Grand Rapids. He became a confirmed internationalist. He runs for Congress in 1948 as a rebel against an entrenched, isolationist, moss-back Republican who thought the world ended at the Michigan-Indiana line. And to everyone's astonishment, he won. He goes to Congress. On his first day on the floor of the House, he's tapped on the shoulder by a young beetle-browed Californian who says, "Hi, I'm Dick Nixon." He becomes good friends with a young congressman also having served in the Pacific, whose office is across the hall from his, named John F. Kennedy. And they walk to the floor of the House, where usually their votes cancel out each other, but they become good friends. In years to come, Ford's colleagues in the House will put him on the CIA Oversight Committee. He will hear Douglas MacArthur deliver his Old Soldiers Never Die speech. He goes to Paris to try to persuade Dwight Eisenhower to run for president in 1952. He's on the first NASA Oversight Committee. And of course, he's on the Warren Commission investigating the tragic death of his friend, President John F. Kennedy. And all of these things transpired long before anyone ever heard of Watergate. So it's an amazing career that has been intersectioned with so much of the history of this century.
We'll find out specifically about some of his legislative accomplishments as a Republican in a Democratic-controlled Congress after a few more calls. Birmingham, Alabama. All right, Springfield, New Jersey, you're up next.
Yeah, hi, this is Lauren Beliveau from Springfield, New Jersey.
You in the class?
What?
Are you in the class?
Yeah, I am. Okay, what's the most influential thing Gerald Ford did during his presidency?
Thanks for the call.
The most influential thing he did was, very simply, that he restored the integrity of the White House. It had been dishonored not only by Richard Nixon and Watergate, but also by, it lost a lot of its status under Lyndon Johnson. The single most important thing he did was bring back, not just bring back the reputation of the White House, but in so doing, he restored the balance between the executive and the legislative part of the government.
Birmingham, Alabama. Good evening.
Good evening. I have a question about the relationship of President Nixon and President Ford after he became vice president. Were they close, and did Nixon confide in Ford, or was he kept aloof from him? And also, what type of relationship did President Ford have with President Johnson while he was the minority leader?
Let me go to Richard Norton Smith, since we're talking about legislative activity, if you could take that question.
It's a good question. Actually, in some ways, Nixon did Ford a favor by not bringing him into the White House. Ford actually spent much of his vice presidency on the road. And so, in an ironic sense, when the time came, perhaps inevitably, for him to assume the office, he wasn't tainted in the public eye. He wasn't seen as being Nixon's creation or Nixon's creature. He was still seen very much as Gerald Ford, if anyone, a creation of Capitol Hill. And that obviously served him well in his relations with Congress. The interesting relation with LBJ is fascinating. You know, these are two great politicians. Some people remember the Ev and Jerry show from the mid-'60s. Every week, Ev Dirksen, the Senate Minority Leader, and Jerry Ford, the House Minority Leader, would get together and have breakfast on camera and flail away at the Great Society. But at the same time, one reason why Ford was elected in 1965 by Republicans over Charlie Halleck, who had had the job for many years, they wanted a much more positive as well as a much more aggressive approach, hopefully someday to get out of their minority status. And he tried to provide them with that. And of course, he and LBJ said a few things about each other. Johnson a little more cutting than Ford. That was his nature. But, you know, our viewers might be interested to know that they actually were good friends. And Mrs. Johnson remains one of the dearest friends that the Fords have.
James Cannon?
I wanted to say to that Nixon and Ford were friends from the first day they met, on first day in Congress. And they became somewhat close as family friends, but politically they were very close. They thought alike and voted alike. They had shared a lot of interests like sports and so on. But after Ford became vice president, and he went through the most extraordinary confirmation process, we knew more about Gerald Ford before he took office than we ever have about any other person who became president or vice president. But after he was confirmed and sworn in, it didn't take very long for Ford to realize that they wanted to kind of make him a member of their team. And he sensed that that was the wrong thing to do, so he told Bob Hartman, his chief of staff, accept every reasonable invitation we can, and he deliberately set himself out to tour the country, came back to Washington only when necessary, but spent most of the time on the road for two reasons. One, he wanted not to get involved in any part of the Watergate, and second, just in case he should become president, he wanted to have given the country some idea of who he was.
I'm going to ask Richard Norton Smith about one of the lines that's in James Cannon's book about Gerald Ford. Mr. Cannon writes this: Ford had set the goal of his life to be the sovereign over the part of Congress that most directly represents the people of the nation. He just wanted to be Speaker of the House. How did he go about reaching that goal once he got to Congress?
Well, you know, it was tantalizingly close for a little bit there. He came to Congress in 1948. That was not a good Republican year. A Republican Congress, the first in many years, had just been voted out in the Truman landslide of '48. And I think he saw Dwight Eisenhower as not only the way to go for the future of the Republican Party, what I called modern republicanism, but also the way to put a Republican majority back on Capitol Hill. And again, for the first 2 years of the Eisenhower presidency, it worked. I think he was frustrated for much of the rest of his congressional career. One thing that viewers might be interested to know is that after 1972, he really hoped that after Nixon's election in '68 and with a landslide victory impending in 1972, that this finally would be the year when Republicans took the relative handful of seats that they needed and he would at last attain his goal, and it didn't happen. And so he and Mrs. Ford sat down after the '72 election, and they discussed it, and they came to the decision that he would run one more time in '74, and then he would retire. And in January of 1977, after 25 years, the Fords would leave Washington, and they would come back to Grand Rapids. They left Washington, but under somewhat different circumstances from what they had planned.
In 1992, Gerald Ford sat for an interview with C-SPAN, and here's a portion of that where he talked about just wanting to be Speaker.
My sole political ambition after I went to Congress was to be Speaker of the House. And as I got to be the Republican leader in 1965, that was my first step up the ladder. And I continuously hoped that I would achieve that, but my Democrat competition always had more votes every 2 years. It's interesting, after I lost the 5th time, Betty and I...
Speakership.
For the speakership. See, every 2 years, the Republican nominee competes with the Democrat nominee. And the Democrats won because they had more House members than we Republicans did. So I was always the minority leader, and either John McCormick or Carl Albert were the Democrat speakers. But that was my total political ambition. And after the last time I lost to Carl Albert, Betty and I sat down and said, well, I'll run one more time for Congress. I'll not be a candidate for Republican leader. I'll serve 2 years, and then I'll retire, and we'll either go back to Michigan or stay in Washington. And so I had committed myself to run in 1974 and then retire in January of 1977. Well, things got mixed up starting about fall of 1973, and so all of those plans got changed.
One of our cameras here in the museum on the first floor, this just inside the entranceway. Our next call, again, is Springfield, New Jersey. Good evening.
Hi, my name is Jessica Goldblatt. I was wondering what you think, if anything, had in President Ford's upbringing had to do with his ability to be so forgiving of President Nixon's actions.
James Cannon.
That's a very good question, and it's interesting that this young lady sounds young. That when Gerald Ford was in high school, he consciously and deliberately thought he made up his mind that he would find some good in everyone. That there are no bad people in his view. He was a trusting person, and he believed there was good in everyone, and that in effect is what advanced his career. He was at 12 he became a Boy Scout and he lived the Boy Scout code for all of his life.
LaConner, Washington. Good evening. Connor?
I'm here.
Go right ahead.
All right, thank you. Back in the 1970s, right after Gerald Ford became president, I wrote my first ever letter to the editor of a local newspaper to defend President Ford from the childish sniping perpetrated against him by the media. And it violated my sense of justice. I'll tell you the truth. I got so angry. That motivated me to write it. Well, my question is, and I'm afraid it's quite a bit like the previous caller, is do you think the press enjoyed belittling President Ford because he'd pardoned President Nixon, whom the press hated?
I think there was an animus in the press toward Nixon, certainly, and I think that some of it carried over to President Ford. And when President Ford pardoned Nixon, the press, by and large, was hostile. For example, the Washington Post said this is just a continuation of the cover-up. I don't think that people widely understood at that point, the necessity of pardoning Nixon, that in order to get on with the business of government, that President Ford and the country needed to put that whole terrible episode and era behind them.
Richard Norton Smith has moved just a little ways in the museum. Where are you now?
We're in what we call our transition gallery. President Ford is unique, as you pointed out, at being the only unelected president, but that also means he's the only president that had absolutely no transition. And he found himself walking into the Oval Office on August 9th, 1974, with all the problems that Jim mentioned earlier, but also a host of administrative problems. He had to find a vice president, among other things. King Hussein of Jordan was about to come to town for a state visit. There were some real problems, but also some real possibilities in the Middle East. And so, needless to say, the business of the world does not stop, even for an American political crisis. So we have tried to recreate a sense of those tumultuous days in this area, leading up to and including the pardon. Gerald Ford wanted to be a healer. I mean, he never expected to be president, and he was determined that however long or short he was in the White House, he would try to heal some of the divisions, the cultural as well as political divisions in this country. And he started right away. Actually, he invited the Black Caucus. One of the very first things he did was to invite the Black Caucus from the House to come down to the White House. George Meany, the crusty old lion of the AFL-CIO, not a big Ford supporter, as you might imagine. He brought all kinds of people into the Oval Office. I remember hearing George McGovern tell an amazing story. It was in the spring of 1975, and Saigon was about to fall. And President Ford invited McGovern, along with several others, to a stag dinner at the White House. And McGovern was, frankly, nonplussed. And he said so to the president. He said, you know, I opposed Lyndon Johnson on Vietnam, and he never invited me here. I opposed Richard Nixon on Vietnam, and he never invited me here. No president has invited me in 10 years. And President Ford said, I know, George. That's why I invited you. And that gives you some idea of the kind of man this was. Now, of course, the other two big events in that first month, everyone knows about the pardon. What people tend to forget is that even before the pardon, in some ways equally controversial, was the proposal for a Vietnam amnesty board. And it was a proposal made in front of the VFW, about as hostile an audience as you might imagine. Some would say it was politically foolhardy. Some would say it was politically courageous. In any event, he thought it was important to do, and it was part and parcel with the pardon, both efforts to try to heal the country. In our exhibit here on the pardon, and again, this is classic Ford. When we redid the museum 2.5 years ago, President Ford insisted that we show both sides of the story. And so, for example, we have here the original switchboard from the White House, figuratively in overdrive. They figured they got something like 17,000 telephone calls in the first 24 hours after the announcement on Sunday morning of the pardon, and most of them were hostile. Likewise with the mail, and he insisted that we include at least as much negative mail that he received as positive. And he, in fact, his poll ratings tumbled, 21 points, which I think was the biggest drop ever measured in a single poll. But I would maintain that certainly the pardon was the galvanizing factor there. But I think that the amnesty proposal also ate away at his natural political base: conservative voters, traditional-minded voters, and the military.
From that time, we have a clip of the pardon announcement. We'll see that and then take several more phone calls.
That I cannot rely upon public opinion polls to tell me what is right. I do believe that right makes might, and that if I am wrong, 10 angels swearing I was right would make no difference. I do believe with all my heart and mind and spirit that I, not as president, but as a humble servant of God, will receive justice without mercy if I fail to show mercy. Finally, I feel that Richard Nixon and his loved ones have suffered enough and will continue to suffer no matter what I do, no matter what we, as a great and good nation, can do together to make his goal of peace come true. Now, therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from July 20, 1969 through August 9, 1974.
One of the exhibits at the museum, The Pardon of Richard Nixon. Nyack, New York. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Cannon, for your excellent book. I have enjoyed it very much. President Ford is known as the healer of our nation. A lot is not remembered, it seems, about his economic policies. If I am correct on this, only 2 modern presidents have stood up firmly to congressional spending or overspending, and that was Eisenhower and Gerald Ford. As has been mentioned, his tenure saw a lowering of the recession and inflation, and it seems to me that President Ford, among all modern presidents, deserves the mantle for fiscal conservatism. I was wondering if this could be commented on. It seems certainly a model of good government at the end of this century. And finally, if I am correct, there is still no comprehensive biography on the life and presidency of Gerald Ford. Mr. Cannon's book is excellent, as is Mr. Green's book, The Presidency of Gerald R. Ford. I don't believe either one is comprehensive, and I was wondering if there would be a comprehensive biography on his life and presidency and post-presidency coming out soon. Thank you.
The answer to that question is I'm working on the latter even today. It deserves to be told, not only President Ford's the story of how he got to be president, which is essentially what this book is, but also the story does need to be told and will be told of his presidency itself. You mentioned about President Ford's economic knowledge and ability. It was he and I believe President Truman are the only presidents who knew enough, knew enough about the federal budget to be able to brief the press on it by themselves. President Ford learned this by some dozen or more years on the House Appropriations Committee, which is probably the single most important committee of Congress. It is the committee where the members, the 40-odd members, decide what the government is going to spend. That's the power. So President Ford knew this. He had also studied economics in college. He had some brief experience as a banking board member also. Dr. Arthur Burns once told me that he had worked with half a dozen presidents and that Gerald Ford was the only one who really understood economics. Because he understood it and because of his determination to bring down the excess federal spending, President Ford did turn the direction of spending away from this kind of free spending Congress back to a more responsible level of government spending.
And this is James Cannon's book, Time and Chance, still in print?
It is in print for the University of Michigan Press.
And you mentioned another volume. When will that be available?
When I finish it.
Any estimate?
No, not right now.
Garden City, New York. Good evening.
Mr. Cannon, what was President Ford's reasons for not accepting Ronald Reagan's possible choice to become the Vice President of the United States again in 1980, it is?
In 1980, Did you say?
Yeah, what was his, did he have any political reasons for not accepting Ronald Reagan's...
Ronald Reagan, I don't think, ever made the offer. There were some intermediate negotiations. There was a lot of interest in it, but I think it probably it was in concept a good idea. But basically, President Ford's idea was that President Reagan would be the chief executive officer and he would be the chief operating officer. But there was some concern among a lot of concern among the Reagan people about it, and President Ford himself was not sure this was the right thing to do, and at the convention it just didn't work out, and so President Reagan, or the nominee, chose George Bush instead. But it was talked about, it was discussed, it was seriously considered, but on balance, I think both sides felt it was not the right thing to do.
Richard Norton Smith is just a few feet behind us, still in the transition area. What didn't we cover in that area that would be good for us to know?
Oh, gosh. Well, you know, we all tend to judge presidents by what they complete in office, and that's fair enough. But another way of assessing their performance is by what they begin, particularly if it tends to be ratified by their successors. And when you look at the Ford presidency, probably the most notable economic policy really was economic deregulation. And that was sped along by the chairman of his Council of Economic Advisors, none other than Alan Greenspan. And in fact, President Ford, for the last few years, laughs about his famed Whip Inflation Now program, whose lifespan was a good deal shorter than Alan Greenspan's economic influence in this country. But in fact, Ford, as a conservative, Midwest, sort of common sense, Main Street Republican, hated economic regulation. I mean, he thought there was too much of it, too much red tape. It was weighing down the entrepreneurial spirit of the country. So when he became president, he really wanted to make that a top priority. And in fact, they drew up legislation, and they actually got the Congress to pass it, deregulating the railroads. They also had legislation ready to go deregulating the airlines. And that bill, in fact, was adopted largely intact by the Carter administration, which built upon and accelerated the economic deregulation. And now, of course, economic deregulation enjoys bipartisan and indeed international support. But that's something that began very early in the Ford presidency. And in fact, one of the very first things that he did in his first week as president was to name Alan Greenspan his chief economic advisor.
We have several mobile cameras with Richard Norton Smith. They're just a few feet behind where we are in this replica of the Oval Office. I'm going to ask Mr. Smith maybe to walk up to behind where we are and bring one of the cameras around. We'll take another call, and then we'll have him help us look at what's in this office that's related to Gerald Ford. But Grand Rapids, good evening. Grand Rapids? Right here in Grand Rapids, one more time. Let's try a call from Kent, Washington.
Yeah, just a question about the assassination attempts on President Ford. What were some of the groups and their motivations? And then also, with the election in 1976 and his loss to Jimmy Carter, how might Ford, if elected to serve from 76 to 80, would he have handled the Iranian hostage situation differently? Thank you.
The Iranian hostage situation, it would be just sheer conjecture to answer that, what might have done in that situation. But the assassination attempts were partly, the first one was by the Manson gang, by a representative of the Manson gang, and that was very close, very close. I happened to be nearby when it happened, and it was only by the quickness and skill of a Secret Service agent that that his life was saved. The second one, I think, was an act by an individual and not by an organized group. But it was a good fortune that President Ford escaped them both.
James Cannon is joining us in a replica of the Oval Office that's here in the Gerald Ford Museum in Grand Rapids. And Richard Norton Smith, tell us, if you would, what in this office is directly connected to Gerald Ford?
Well, almost everything in the office has a connection, sentimental or otherwise. The desk, of course, is a replica. Most of the furniture here in the office are replicas. But that is a replica of the desk that the president used. It actually had been used by vice presidents since 1896. What you might find of particular interest is on the morning of August 9th, when President Ford walked into this office and sat down behind that desk, it was, of course, full of listening devices. And his first order as president was to take them out. And they did so. And according to the president, a week later, they, by happenstance, found one still left in the wall of the Oval Office. The ship's wheel, which is located over there near the desk, has great historical significance. That actually is the wheel from the SS Mayaguez, which was presented to President Ford in July of 1975 as a token of gratitude for the rescue operation of that merchant ship and its crew, which, as you may remember, was taken in international waters by Cambodian forces just in the wake of the fall of Saigon. Also, sort of interesting, the portrait of George Washington, not unique to the Ford Oval Office. Indeed, it's in every Oval Office, not necessarily that portrait, but that is one constant, thank God. And of course, George Washington observed the bicentennial president. Gerald Ford presided over the nation's 200th birthday celebrations. And in our collection of bicentennial gewgaws, one of my very favorites is the George Washington fire hydrant, which is not in the Oval Office.
Is this replica the same dimensions as the actual Oval Office?
Yeah, in fact, this is the first full-scale replica of the Oval Office in America. The Johnson Library, which of course was built before the Ford, has a 7/8 scale replica. It's spectacular, but it's 7/8. And the story goes that it was added at the last minute during the construction process at President Johnson's insistence. And the best that the architects could do, given that fact, they had to put it on top of the building, and therefore it could only be 7/8. And then the next great question was, who was going to tell President Johnson that his Oval Office was 7/8 of the original? And they decided that Mrs. Johnson could tell him.
Our next call is from here in Grand Rapids. Good evening.
Yes, in Gerald Ford's vice presidential confirmation hearing, the hypothetical question was posed to Mr. Ford about pardoning Richard Nixon should he become president. And in effect, he responded that the American people would not stand for it. With his election defeat in 1976, is it accurate to say the American people didn't stand for the pardon by Mr. Ford?
Mr. Cannon.
Well, that is correct. During his confirmation hearings, he indicated that he did not think the American people would accept the pardon of Richard Nixon. And when he went into office, he had no intention of pardoning him. It was not on his mind. And only after the first few weeks of being plagued by questions, and but not only about what he was going to do about the charges against Mr. Nixon, was he going to do anything about him, and what was he going to do with the Nixon papers and tapes? So this became such a burden that he was vexed by it, but not until his first press conference, it was about 2 weeks after he became president, not until then did he realize the reporters' preoccupation with this subject. He went into that press conference believing that they would want to ask him about his plans for the future. And when I think about a third of the questions were about Nixon, was he going to pardon him, he was vexed, and to make matters worse, he answered the questions in about 3 or 4 different ways. He went off the podium realizing he had been confused, that he had made the matter worse, and he was angry with himself. When he looked at the transcript of the press conference, he realized it was even worse than he thought, and he had to do something. So he thought about it for a couple of days, and then he called in 4 of his principal advisors. Al Haig, who was then still chief of staff, Phil Buchan, his counsel, Jack Marsh, and Bob Hartman, his counselors, and told them that this is, unless somebody talked him out of it, this was what he was going to do. And interestingly, 3 of those people came back, 2 of them came back later, Hartman and Marsh came back separately and independently and said, are you sure? And he said, absolutely. And Barb Hartman said something to the effect that a poll was going to come out soon, maybe they ought to wait for that. And President Ford said, I don't need a poll to tell me when to do what's right. He made up his mind he was going to do it. He told Phil Buchan, find out how I can do it. And some 10 days later, he did it. Now, there's always been a question about why he didn't get some statement of contrition from President Nixon. And the answer to that is, one, that Nixon didn't want to give a statement of contrition. He didn't want to admit his guilt, though acceptance of the pardon is an admission of guilt. But the second thing was that Al Haig had got word through to President Nixon that the pardon was coming and he didn't have to make a statement of contrition. So that is the simple answer to why Nixon didn't make a statement of contrition. Ford changed his mind, obviously, from the time of his confirmation until, a year later, a little more than a year later, when he realized that the idea, that the danger of this becoming the central issue of American public affairs was so great that he had to do something, and with that one sweep of his hand, he wanted to wipe this off the front pages and the nightly news.
This is one of the issues that Gerald Ford spoke with us about in our 1992 interview. Here's a small portion of that.
The first press conference I had was about 3.5 weeks after being sworn in. At that press conference in the White House, 90% of the questions from the press were, what was I going to do about Mr. Nixon, his tapes, his papers, etc. Well, I thought there were more important things for me to be asked about: foreign policy, economic problems, etc. As I walked back from the East Room where we had the press conference to the Oval Office, I thought to myself, is this going to be the questioning for the next 2.5 years while I'm president? I thought there were more important things for me as president to be concerned about than the problems of one man. Well, I soon found out that because of the Department of Justice and others, I was spending at least 25% of my time every day discussing with lawyers, what do I do about Mr. Nixon's tapes, papers, etc. Well, at the same time, we had an economic recession, the worst in the post-World War II period. We had allies that were concerned about what a new president was going to do in foreign policy. We had the potential threat of what the Soviet Union might do under these circumstances. I felt I had to spend 100% of my time on those problems instead of spending 25% of my time on the problems of one person. And the only way to get the deck cleared, to spend all of my time on the problems of 250 million Americans, was to pardon Mr. Nixon. It was just that pragmatic.
Issaquah, Washington. Good evening.
Good evening. This is Mary Ellen Sheridan, and I have some belated kudos for President and Mrs. Ford for their help with my affirmative action. During his administration, I filed the first sex discrimination suit against the state of Florida, and I couldn't afford an attorney. I had just been divorced and was trying to raise 3 daughters, and I wasn't getting any response from the EEOC. So since I had worked in the White House during the Eisenhower administration, I decided I'd write to President Ford and see what he would do for me. Well, sure enough, he sent the EEOC to Florida, and it was just shocking, what they found down there. And I subsequently, Ruben Askew was told that he had to rehire me in a professional position. At that point, only men could have professional positions. And he was so angry that he told his then Secretary of the Department of Environmental Regulation, Jay Landers, to hire me but get rid of me as soon as he could. And in those days, there was no such term as sexual harassment, but I can define it now because I went through 3 years of hell. But I think I saved something for the women in Florida, and I hope that things are better there now.
Thanks very much for your points, Washington. James Cannon.
Well, that's a very interesting story, and it does reflect President Ford. I think this would reflect not just his feeling as president, But President Ford's basic responsiveness from the time he was a congressman to the letter of an important constituent.
One of the things you write about in your book that was related to the pardon was the remark about our long national nightmare is over, and whether or not that would even be in the remarks or not. Give us the background on who wrote that line and whether it was going to stay or not.
Bob Hartman wrote that line, and Bob had been with Minority Leader Ford for some years and knew what he would say and what he would like to say. And about, I believe, 2 days before President Nixon resigned, when it was pretty certain, Ford was not going to be absolutely certain until Nixon himself told him he was going to resign, but Vice President Ford thought that he ought to get a speech ready, so he told Hartman to do it. And Hartman got up early one morning and wrote the speech and brought it in, and President Ford liked it and thought, well, you know, it's good, but let me look at it again tomorrow. And then the day before he was to become president, he looked at it again. President Ford looked at it again and called Bob in and said, now this line, Bob, about long national nightmare, I think that's a little rough on Dick, don't you? And Bob said, no, absolutely not. He said, whatever you do, that's got to be in there. That's going to be the headline. That's what you have to tell people. You have to tell the country about this. That is what people are going to remember. And President Ford sort of said, okay, and finally agreed to do it. But it was only because of Bob Hartman that that important line stayed in there. It did tell the story. The long national nightmare was over when Ford took office.
Another of our calls from Springfield, New Jersey. Good evening.
Hi, this is...
I tell you what, before you ask your question, for our viewers who may have just joined us, we get a lot of calls from your class. Can you tell us what your class project is?
Mr. Lassie is our class teacher, and basically, since you guys are doing the countdown for the presidents, he's giving us extra credit to watch the program and call in with answers. Plus, like, it helps us learn more about presidents because that's what we're doing. We're going to go over all the
You all have good questions. What's your question tonight?
My question tonight is that early in your program, you had stated that Gerald Ford Jr. was not his real name, and he had not known his real father until adulthood. My question is that what was like Ford's reaction when he finally found out about his real name and his father, and who was the one that told him?
He had some as a young teenager, he had some idea that his mother might have been married before, but he didn't really ever focus on it because he looked on Jerry Ford Sr. as his true father. He felt they were close, they thought alike, they loved each other, and he was a marvelous man. But Ford was about 14, 15 years old and working in a diner to earn money for his, to be able to go to school. And a stranger came in one day and looked across at him and he said, and the young boy said, can I help you? And the stranger said, are you Leslie King? And he said, no, I'm Jerry Ford. And the man came over and said, you're Leslie King, I'm your father. And Ford was stunned. And the man said, well, I want to take you out to lunch. Can you go out to lunch with me? And Ford asked Bill Scugis, who ran the diner, what he thought. And said, sure, go ahead, he looks all right. And so the young teenager went out and met his stepmother. Leslie King had married again and had a daughter. He met the daughter, and the four of them went to lunch. And at the end of it, Leslie King said, well, now I've got a big ranch out in Wyoming. Wouldn't you like to come out and live with me? And Ford said, no, I like it here. He said, well, could I help you financially? And Ford said, well, that would be nice. And so Leslie King gave him a $20 bill, and it was the only money he ever received from his rich father in his life.
Mr. I believe is it Lazio, I hope I pronounced it right, class in New Jersey is doing this project. We'd like to remind our other educators that C-SPAN in the Classroom has a lot of information on this series available. You can get it several ways. 202-626-4858 is the phone number to call during regular business hours, but also cspan.org/ museum.org/classroom is a place to find out the information about the American President's Life Portrait Series if you'd like to use any of this in your classroom activities. Again, 202-626-4858. We have a whole staff of educators at C-SPAN that are there to help you in your classes for this. Jonesboro, Arkansas. Good evening.
Hello. Sir, first off, let me thank you very much for allowing us to have something on TV besides all that filth on the other stations. But
You're welcome.
Mr. Cannon, I've got a question for you. When Gerald Ford became president, who did he choose as his vice president, and did he give Ronald Reagan any consideration for to be the vice president?
No, I don't think he gave Ronald Reagan any serious consideration at all. It was his typical way. Ford addressed this very methodically. He talked to several people, and he talked to close friends from the House of Representatives, and he asked Bryce Harlow to make a kind of a summary of it, to make some recommendations. And Harlow listed about a dozen possible candidates and rated each one of them on various aspects, his political record, his elective office, and his philosophy, and so on. And the closest ones, the highest ones with the highest points were Nelson Rockefeller and George Bush. And President Ford felt it was important to choose someone who had been elected to national office, to a significant office and had a national reputation, and he thought, on balance, he would be better to choose Nelson Rockefeller. And they were friends. They were not politically close, but they had great respect for each other. And it was typical of Ford that he wanted to choose the best man for the job. And some of his advisors said, "Well, aren't you afraid that Nelson Rockefeller will overshadow you?" And Ford said, "Not at all." He knew perfectly well nobody overshadows the president, and it's very typical of Ford that he wanted to get the best person possible, whatever their background, whatever their political philosophy.
We'll take another call and then find out where Richard Norton Smith is in the library, in the museum. But first, Hilton Head, South Carolina.
Good evening. Hello.
Good evening. Go right ahead.
Yes. This is non-political, but Mrs. Ford was my babysitter and my two brothers, and a powerful influence she was. Because
was that here in Grand Rapids?
Yes, we lived in Michigan, just north of Grand Rapids, a little tiny town called Howard City, and we were at Whitefish Lake, which was the summer resort, and this lovely lady named Betty Bloomer was our babysitter. And all three of us went on to become physicians, like my father was. He was a country doctor. And Betty Bloomer was our inspiration.
How old were you at the time, and how old was she?
Well, I'm 75 now, and she's a little bit older than I am. But, you know, not only did Gerald bring total honesty and integrity to the office, but he brought with him the most wonderful lady in the world, Betty Bloomer. And she inspired all of us to be better. We all went on to become physicians, surgeons. I served 3 years with the Navy in combat before I became a doctor. But we were all proud of the Fords, and we've tried to be good members of their family.
Thanks for that call. Before we get a comment, I might remind you, Betty Ford, we had hoped, would be joining us this evening for a short telephone interview, but she's a little bit under the weather with a cold and was not able to do that this evening. James Cannon.
Well, I know she'll be interested in hearing that from the children for whom she babysat when she was somewhat younger. She was, it was and is a marvelous woman. She, because of President Ford's or House Representative Ford's activities, both in the House, he was a very hard-working congressman, and his efforts to campaign for others, he was often away from home, and she raised their 4 children and did a marvelous job. Each one of them is a very impressive person. The 3 sons and the daughter are all very impressive and fine citizens themselves.
A little bit later in our program, we'll take a few minutes to focus on her career as a political wife and also First Lady. But Richard Norton Smith, you were at a special exhibit, one of the temporary exhibits here at the museum.
That's right. You know, one of the things that President Ford has enjoyed most since leaving the White House, he has visited over 200 college campuses. He loves to lecture, and I think he listens as much as he lectures, but he loves to talk to young people and to share stories of history. You know, having, as we said earlier, participated in so much of it, he has a real sort of obligation, sense of obligation about passing it on. And he's very concerned that we live in a historically illiterate time, a time that's getting its history from the likes of Oliver Stone. So he made it very clear when this museum was originally constructed back in 1981 that he did not want it to be just a museum about himself or about his presidency. And particularly in the last 3-4 years since I've been here, we've taken that very seriously, and we've done a number of major temporary exhibits that look at the whole range of American and, in fact, world history. We did a big World War I show last year. Right now we're planning a big Lewis and Clark exhibit for next year, a Lincoln exhibition. And what is here, actually we're about to celebrate the bicentennial of the White House, and what better way to do that than to bring the White House, in effect, to Grand Rapids. This is an extraordinary recreation of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It is 60 feet long. It weighs 10 tons. It is the brainchild and lifelong obsession of a wonderful couple, John and Jan Zweifel, who live in Orlando, Florida, who actually gained access to the White House, to the private rooms of the White House, for the first time during the Ford presidency. And as a result of the Ford's openness, the Zweifels were able to create this model and make it absolutely authentic. And I'll take you through here. This is, of course, the White House as it appears today. It is updated for each president. So this is the Clinton White House, beginning here in the East Wing area. This is sort of the First Lady's area, her office, her staff, many of the social functions of the White House. And here is the White House movie theater. Those 4 overstuffed chairs in front are the best seats in Washington. The President, the First Lady, and their special guests would occupy those. Here is the Jacqueline Kennedy Garden, named in honor, of course, of the great First Lady who did so much to restore the White House and raise our awareness of its history. Then we come into the main residence. There are, by the way, 132 rooms in the White House. We don't have all of them here. You're on the south lawn, if you can imagine, and we've taken the wall apart here. On the 3rd floor of the family quarters, beginning with the Lincoln sitting room. This was Richard Nixon's favorite room. He used to hole up there in the summertime and turn the air conditioning all the way up and put on a fire. He liked to write speeches up there. Next to that is the Lincoln bedroom, which is a bit of a misnomer because Lincoln almost certainly did not sleep in that bed. It was Harry Truman's idea to bring together all the Lincoln-era furniture in that room that Lincoln had used as an office and cabinet room during the Civil War. Below is, of course, the largest room in the White House. This is the East Room, used for presidential press conferences, entertainment after state dinners. This is where a president who dies in office lies in state. And it was also the scene of Susan Ford's high school prom. And way down here below we have what's called the Vermeil Room. The White House has the largest Vermeil collection in the country. That, of course, is gold-plated silver. Next to that is the China Room, inspired by Mrs. Benjamin Harrison, who 100 years ago painted her own china and began collecting and displaying that of her predecessors. Above it is the Green Room, and if you look right through the hallway, you can see the grand ceremonial staircase down which the President, First Lady, and a foreign guest would come to begin an evening with a state dinner. Up on the 3rd floor is what's called the Treaty Room. U.S. Grant used that. President McKinley used that as an office during the Spanish-American War. This is the rather unimaginatively named Yellow Oval Room. It's a kind of family sitting room on the 3rd floor. The Blue Room, decorated for Christmas, down here. And way down here is the Diplomatic Reception Room. Now again, imagine you're on the south lawn of the White House. You're a head of state visiting the United States. You would be greeted on the south lawn ritualistically and then led into the White House through the Diplomatic Reception Room. That also, by the way, is historically significant as the room in which Franklin Roosevelt delivered his famous fireside chats. Another FDR connection next to the Diplomatic Reception Room is the Map Room. Another misnomer, no maps to be seen, but during World War II, Winston Churchill came and stayed for weeks at a time, and it was his habit to follow the course of the war by spreading his maps out down there. Up above that is the Red Room, and on the 3rd floor is the President's personal study here in the residence. You can see the TV is on. Next to that, here on the 3rd floor, would be the Clintons' bedroom, and next to that is a sitting room used by Mrs. Clinton. Below that is the state dining room. By the way, every one of those lights in the candelabra are the size of a grain of rice. That is the Reagan china, that brilliant red china. The state dining room can accommodate up to about 140 guests. And by the way, it's been almost 20 years since the Reagan china was created, so that means the next president almost certainly will be responsible for providing the nation with another set. The great A.P. Healy portrait of Lincoln hangs over the mantel, and it is in that mantel, of course, that is carved John Adams' famous prayer that none but wise and virtuous men will inhabit this house. Below the state dining room is the White House Library. Mrs. Millard Fillmore, a school teacher by trade, began the White House Library. Every one of those books individually made, like every piece of flatware, every lamp, everything you see here on the model. By the way, before I forget, way up on the 4th floor, one of the Ford's favorite rooms, that is the solarium. And back in 1925, the Coolidges had what they called their sky parlor. Well, of course, during the Truman presidency, the whole house was rebuilt, and a modern solarium was put up there. It was Caroline Kennedy's preschool. The Johnson girls like to hang out up there, and it's very popular with presidential families through the years. Now, before 1902, the White House residence was also an office building. The Roosevelts, the Teddy Roosevelt family, of course, had a number of rambunctious children, and Mrs. Roosevelt suggested none too subtly to her husband that perhaps he would like to move his offices out of their home into a new wing. Well, there wasn't a West Wing at the time. What they were glass conservatories built during James Buchanan's time. And TR characteristically said, smash the glass houses. Down they came, and in their place was built first a temporary and later a permanent West Wing, which is in effect is an office building. Here along the colonnade, you can see in there the press room, very familiar to viewers, particularly C-SPAN viewers. You can see the podium where the press secretary or sometimes the president himself will make announcements. That used to be a swimming pool. FDR, of course, suffered from polio, and he liked to swim. And when Richard Nixon became president, he covered over the swimming pool, and he put the press in there. As you turn the corner, that long room is, you've probably guessed already, the cabinet room of the White House. And in fact, if you come back here in 2 years, we are going to put an addition onto this building, and we are going to build the cabinet room as it appeared during the Ford years as a classroom. We bring thousands and thousands of school kids through here every year, and right now we don't have an education center, so that's going to change. Over here is the Oval Office, without a doubt the most famous room in America, perhaps in the world. The Oval Office in its current configuration dates to 1934 and FDR. There had been a fire in the Oval Office during the Hoover presidency, and FDR had it rebuilt, reconfigured, and it tends to get redecorated with each administration. Mrs. Clinton hired the Little Rock decorator Kaki Hawkersmith, and she came up with that brilliant blue and gold and yellow pattern in the Oval Office. The rest of the West Wing basically are executive offices, a little bit of a pecking order involved here. This great big corner office looks very desirable. You will not be surprised to learn that it is the office of the Chief of Staff. The Vice President also has an office here, the National Security Advisor, the Press Secretary, and maybe a favored speechwriter or two.
What we've been able to see in your tour, that you are putting our camera operators, Darren and Jeff, through their paces. We can see that in the monitor here. They are really moving fast to keep up with you. Before we leave that area, and Darren knows, I think, where this next shot is, I'm going to ask James Cannon what your job was in the Ford administration and where in that building your office was.
It was above, it's above and slightly to the west of the Oval Office. It's on the southwest corner of the building, just west of the Oval Office, on the second floor. On that floor also, it was the office traditionally occupied by the Domestic Policy Advisor. And in that same area were Bill Seidman, who had the Economic Policy Office, and down the hall, Phil Buchan as a counsel to the President. And around the corner were Jack Marsh and Max Friedersdorf and the Congressional Relations staff.
We'll take a few calls and then find out a little bit more about this facility. Portland, Oregon, thanks for your patience. Good evening.
Good evening. This is Steve Lilly. I'm a Vietnam vet. I turned 19 at Fort Bliss, Texas, a reception station, and turned 21 in Vietnam. I came home in May of 1969, And I've been listening to the telecast, and a couple of things that I've bulleted here that I thought were worthy of praise for Gerald Ford were, number one is courage to grant amnesty for those folks that went to Canada during that ugly time in our history. Being a Vietnam veteran, I was kind of split on the issue, and I thought it took a lot of courage, but I thought it also brought an end to a very ugly time over that troubling thing. And the other thing that through his presidency that I thought was very worthwhile was the integrity that his wife and his family brought to the White House. I think that that integrity has not been repeated, and I think that when we look back over the last couple of candidates and the last couple of residents of the White House, that we have to hold our take our hat off to both Gerald, especially his wife, and his family. And I'm also exceptionally proud of the fact that he took the courage in the face of the American people to pardon Nixon and bring an end to that ugly period of our history.
Thanks, Portland. Part of the exhibit here, as you saw, is talking about healing the scars of Vietnam was the headline on part of the exhibit, and some of the medals that some of the veterans sent back to the president after he did offer clemency. Bellevue, Washington, good evening.
Hi, I would like to ask James Cannon why Gerald Ford bothered to ruin his reputation by getting involved in Clinton's February 1999 impeachment trial by telling senators not to convict Clinton for perjury when Clinton's ongoing scandals are 10 times worse than Nixon's Watergate and are currently jeopardizing our country. Thank you.
The answer to that, basically, is that President Ford thought that this controversy over President Clinton was, again, coming to the situation where it was going to tear the country apart. He had seen one president almost impeached and forced to resign. He had been through that experience as no other man had. And he felt that the country should not be taken through that experience again. And he felt that while President Clinton's actions were reprehensible, that nevertheless that there should be a solution other than impeachment. And he took that position, and it was somewhat out of his pattern of his conduct, because he has rather carefully refrained from commenting on what other presidents have done. But he felt it was the right thing to do, and so he made that decision, and he proposed what he felt was a reasonable compromise.
New Waterford, Ohio, good evening.
Good evening. I'd like to speak to Mr. Cannon, please.
Go right ahead.
Mr. Cannon, I noticed you sitting there. There's a gold helmet behind you. I was wondering if there's any, whether you can identify that or what it stands for. It's directly behind you on the shelf.
Well, have him take a look. It's over your right shoulder.
I don't know what that is.
I think we've got Richard Norton Smith with us. Perhaps you can shed some light on it. It's what looks like a gold helmet. It's next to the space shuttle here in the Oval Office.
Boy, you know, I don't know. Unless it's the University of Michigan.
When we take a break, maybe we can get over and see what...
We'll take a look at it.
Couldn't even be Notre Dame. You know, one of President Ford's proudest boasts, in effect, is that he was the first president who went back onto college campuses. Remember, the 60s and early 70s, it was virtually impossible for a president, didn't matter what his party, to venture onto a college campus. And one of the very first things he did as president was to accept an invitation from Father Hesburgh at Notre Dame. And he went there, had a great visit, and, you know, the hex was broken. He felt that it was again safe for an American president to go back into the classroom.
We just found out from one of our camera operators back here that the American Veterans Organization gave it to the president. We'll try to get a little bit more detail. In front of the Oval Office is a banister that describes some of the items here, and that's one of the things that's mentioned. We'll go take a look at it during our break and let you know. Richard Norton Smith, the exhibit of the White House that you showed us earlier has a few signs that say don't touch. But in spite of that, this is a museum you've described as hands-on history.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Very much so. Basically, it's the difference between a traditional museum where you, the visitor, are a passive onlooker. You're looking at documents in a case, pictures on a wall. the difference between that and becoming an active participant. You know, there is no excuse for a dull book or a dull life or a dull museum, and the 4 years were in fact very colorful, very eventful, as you've heard tonight, very controversial. It's a great story, and from the very beginning we wanted to reimagine this story and to take a whole generation that didn't experience it and put them inside that story in ways that you really might not expect. For example, the first gallery you see when you come into this museum is a 70s disco, and overhead is a multi-screen recreation of the cultural and political divisions of the late 60s, early 70s. There's also all kinds of detritus from that era, including leisure suits and pet rocks and 8-track cassettes and the like. And we wanted to plunge you into the era before we introduced you to first the sequence of events, particularly the Watergate scandal, to the Ford presidency, and then, of course, President Ford himself. We have, among other things here, a working teleprompter, an actual presidential podium with a teleprompter and a TV camera and an actual Ford campaign speech from the fall of 1976. And we invite our visitors, particularly young people, to get up there and, in fact, practice their oratorical skills. The very Oval Office in which you are located during the day ordinarily is a 6-minute sound and light show, which actually takes the visitor inside this most famous workplace in America on a typical working day, not a day of crisis, but a typical day, and gives you a sense of what is it like to be president. And then I think more than anything else is what this museum tries to do. We try to give you a very personal encounter with Gerald and Betty Ford, and we try to communicate as vividly as possible what's it like to be president, and particularly what was it like to be president in the tumultuous times of the mid-70s.
A few numbers. How many visitors do you have?
We had last year about 118,000 visitors. We expect to top that this year, in part because of this and other temporary exhibits.
And how big is staff, and what's the budget?
The staff is too small for what it does. These temporary shows are put together by all of 4 people, myself included. Our total staff is about 10, but of course we also have another 9 people over in Ann Arbor at the Gerald Ford Presidential Library, which is located on the campus at the University of Michigan. And in fact, just last week, President Ford had a great honor bestowed on him. He came back to his beloved alma mater to have the Board of Regents decide to name the School of Public Policy over there for him. And that's part of an ongoing effort that we have to bring the Ford Library much more into the life of the University of Michigan.
What's the relationship between the Ford Library and the Ford Museum?
We are actually kindred institutions. We are one and the same. I'm the director of both. President Ford decided, really back during his congressional days, that he wanted to give his papers to the University of Michigan. He loved the place. It's a second home to him. But he also thought that it would be appropriate for those papers to be in an academic setting, long before he ever thought there might be a presidential library. So once he became president, of course, then it became clear that there would be a lot more papers, there would be even of greater historical significance, but there also would be a presidential museum. And so the decision was taken, and it was unprecedented, to split the facility. So the papers are to be found, along with all the AV materials and the like, on the campus at the University of Michigan, while the museum was placed here in downtown Grand Rapids, where, by the way, it helped to spark a major renewal of this city that is going on to this day.
Manhasset, to get a couple of calls.
I was just going to say that the separation of the library and the museum, I always thought, and have talked to President Ford about it, was a typical example of a man who'd spent his life as a legislator. Both Grand Rapids and Ann Arbor wanted these facilities, and so he made the constructive decision to give part to one and part to the other, like a good congressman.
Manhasset, New York. Good evening.
Hello, my name is J.P. Gabrielle. I go to Manhasset Middle School in Manhasset, New York. I'm a 12-year-old 7th grader. My question for you is, do you think President Ford felt any added responsibilities after the troubles with Nixon and the JFK tragedy?
Can you describe your question a little bit more?
Do you think President Ford felt any added responsibilities after the troubles with Nixon and then the JFK tragedy?
I think certainly he did. In fact, the JFK tragedy was a terrible experience for him because they had been colleagues in the House and they had been friends, not political allies, but friends, and there was a great mutual respect there. And I know that it was a painful experience for President Ford to be part of the Warren Commission and have to see what had happened and see the photographs of the slain president and to go through the ordeal of what had to be done to make a judgment of whether there was a conspiracy or that it was the act of a single person. And as you probably know from your studies, the Warren Commission final report, partly amended by President Ford and a couple of other members of the commission, the staff originally wanted to say there was no conspiracy, there was just one single gunman. And President Ford and the others, with their very cautious way, said that we have no evidence that there was anything but a single gunman. We have no evidence that there was any conspiracy.
Houston, good evening.
Hi, good evening. It's Brian Newman calling from Houston, Texas. I'd like to commend you on your wonderful series there on the presidents. I'd also like to thank Mr. Cannon for his wonderful biography of President Ford, and I actually would like to ask Mr. Cannon and Mr. Norton Smith why they feel that President Ford seems to have been so underrated and overlooked in recent history, and do they think that his character, which has certainly seemed to lack in the office recently, will show in the long run of history? How do you feel like that he will actually be rated?
I think he will be. I think he will continue to climb in the course of history, and as we have some distance to look back on the accomplishments that he had in a very brief time in office. I think one reason is that he was in office for a very short time, and I think the other reason is that most presidents are remembered more for what they say than what they did, and actually President Ford did far more than what he talked about.
Mr. Smith?
I think there's a lot to that. I think also it tells you a lot about our political culture and how it's evolved, particularly in the age of television. You know, Gerald Ford is not a colorful or dramatic or might I say, a polarizing figure. And I think the modern presidents who tend to be enshrined first by academic historians, but also I think to some degree by the public, are those kind of swashbuckling figures, whether it's TR or FDR or John F. Kennedy with his magnificent eloquence. Those figures who really give almost a spiritual lift to the nation, who share their vision, who get us caught up with that vision, who set the agenda for their times, who dominate those times, perhaps overawe Congress and the media. And that wasn't Gerald Ford's style.
Richard Norton Smith and James Cannon continuing with us for about another hour here at the Gerald Ford Museum. We're going to take a short break, though, and we'll be right back. But first, here's part of President Ford's. This is his first address to Congress. It's August 12th, 1974, just 3 days after taking office.
This Congress, unless it's changed, I am confident will be my working partner as well as my most constructive critic. I'm not asking for conformity. I'm dedicated to the two-party system. And you know which party I belong to. I do not want a honeymoon with you. I want a good marriage. I want progress and I want problem solving, which requires my best efforts and also your best efforts. I have no need to learn how Congress speaks for the people. As president, I intend to listen. But I also intend to listen to the peoples themselves, all the people, as I promised last Friday. I want to be sure that we are all tuned in to the real voice of America. My administration starts off by seeking unity in diversity. My office door has always been open, and that is how it's going to be at the White House.
In a moment, we'll continue our look at the life of Gerald Ford, but first some background information on the nation's 38th president.
Welcome back to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Our series on the American presidents' life portraits tonight is focusing on our 38th president, our only president who served in that office without having been directly elected president or vice president. We're about 140 miles northwest of Detroit, in the town where Gerald Ford was raised, and the town he represented in Congress for 25 years before becoming vice president and then president. Our guests this evening are James Cannon, who's author of Time and Chance, Gerald Ford's Appointment with History, and Richard Norton Smith, who's director of the Gerald Ford Museum. And we invite you to join us, 202-624-1111 if you're in the Eastern or Central time zone, but if you're in the Mountain or Pacific time zone, 202-624-1115. We'll start this segment by asking both our guests about the critics of Gerald Ford, both then and now. James Cannon, who were his critics then, when he was president?
Well, his critics were the Democrats, but the critics find it hard to fault Gerald Ford in a personal sense because in his confirmation process, every aspect of his background was looked at, and they couldn't find any taint on his old record. What I would criticize him for is that he was good at managing the president, but he was not good at articulating his goals, and that, among other reasons, is why he didn't get elected. His real problem was that he was not enough of a politician to get himself elected, and had he done so, then I think the country would have been a very different thing. And it was not just that he was deliberate on his part. He was just, he's a workhorse and not a show horse. And so much of the American presidency has become, in this television age, the White House has become a stage. And the president has become the principal actor on that stage, and Ford does not know how to act. He is what you see right there, a very solid and somewhat stolid man, and he simply could not articulate his goal for America well enough for the people to elect him.
And Richard Norton Smith, who are Gerald Ford's critics today?
Curiously, you know, when he was in office, he was widely regarded as the most conservative president since Calvin Coolidge. Today, to the extent that he has critics, I think they're probably on the right. There's some people in his own party who resent the fact that, for example, he is very outspokenly pro-choice on the issue of abortion. He and Mrs. Ford have been, of course, great champions of the ERA. They have been vocally in support of gay rights. They have not suggested that Bill Clinton should be burned at the stake. And they've done a number of things. In fact, on a number of occasions, you know, C-SPAN every year broadcasts the president's return to Washington. He goes back to the National Press Club every year and often talks about Congress. And, of course, he's delighted that there's a Republican Congress. He waited a long time in vain for that to happen. But he has not been reluctant to voice from time to time some criticism, including of former Speaker Gingrich for the way that he was running the House. And that doesn't sit well with some in his own party.
A little more than 45 minutes left in our focus on Gerald Ford's presidency. Summit, New Jersey, good evening.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Butler, and my question is, in his State of the Union message delivered to the joint session of Congress in 1976, Ford asked Congress to act in the spirit of a new realism. And I was wondering how this philosophy led to clashes with the Democratic-controlled Congress.
What he hoped to do when he set forth his goals in '76 was to bring the country together and really project as well as he could what he wanted to do for the country. He was really running on his record as in some 16 months as president at that point. But what he wanted to do was bring the Congress together, and to a great extent he did. There was the most extraordinary animus between the White House and Congress during the Nixon administration, and to some extent in the Johnson administration before that. His first objective, at which he succeeded in part, was to bring back comity between the White House and the Congress.
Burbank, California, good evening.
Good evening. Let me say, first of all, what a great honor it is to be on with Mr. Norton Smith. I'm halfway through the George Washington book, and I just picked up the Herbert Hoover book.
You have excellent taste. Thank you.
I have a question. I'd heard that President Ford was scheduled to retire shortly before he became vice president, and I'm wondering if that's true, and if so, what kind of retirement plans did he have that were interrupted by his assuming a higher office?
Mr. Smith.
Well, yes, as we said earlier, he did indeed intend to retire, to come back here in 1977, come back to Grand Rapids. My understanding was he thought, he'd put his name on a law firm door, make a little bit of money. Jim can tell you the specifics, but I know for a fact that he left office after 25 years in Washington. They didn't have any money. And his intention was to come back home to Grand Rapids and practice law, maybe do a little bit of speaking, and that was it.
That's correct. When on election night in 1972, when Nixon won in a landslide, but the House, the Republicans did not even come close to winning the House. President Ford sat down with Betty at their home in Virginia and said, "This is the last time I'm going to run. This is the last time I'm going to try to be a minority leader. I'm going to run one more time, and then we'll go out, we'll try to make some money, we'll go back to Grand Rapids, or we'll go to somewhere else and live." Her health was not particularly good, and they wanted to go to, if they could, to a warm climate. But he had every intention of practicing law, and he had discussed it informally with a couple of his friends about how he might make a living as a lawyer in Washington, and that was generally his intent. And then along came Watergate, and along came the fall of Agnew, and President Ford was, in effect, called to duty, and as he always had, he was ready to meet his duty.
This is James Cannon's book, Time and Chance, Gerald Ford's, get it up right here, Time and Chance, Gerald Ford's Appointment with History. He's working on a second book about Gerald Ford. He's originally from Athens, Alabama, has a BA from the University of Alabama, was with Time, the Baltimore Sun and Newsweek. It was also assistant to Vice President and Governor Nelson Rockefeller, and was a domestic policy assistant to President Ford. And also our other guest this evening, Richard Norton Smith, who's director of the museum here. He's the author of The Colonel, The Life and Times of Robert McCormick, Thomas Dewey and His Times, the book that the caller mentioned earlier, Patriarch, George Washington and the New American Nation, and also The Uncommon Man, The Triumph of Herbert Hoover. He is from Leominster, Massachusetts, has a degree in government from Harvard University, and has previously been at the Reagan, Eisenhower, and Hoover presidential libraries. Our next call is from Lennon, Michigan. Good evening.
Good evening. I just wondered what days and hours the museum is open.
Mr. Smith.
Very good question. We're open 7 days a week, 9 to 5. Of course, we're going to be closed Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. But otherwise, we're open, and we'd love to see you.
What does it cost to get in?
It's $4 for adults, $3 for senior citizens, defined as 62 or over, And everyone under 16 is free. The latter, by the way, at President Ford's personal insistence.
From one of the magazines about Grand Rapids that was in our motel rooms when we were staying here is this ad for the museum. Nixon pardoned, Vietnam War ends, spacecraft lands on Mars, U.S. turns 200, and they said nothing happened during the Ford presidency. This is an ad for the museum in one of the local magazines. Union City, New Jersey. Good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Cannon. Thank you. During a debate between himself and Jimmy Carter, President Ford made a remark about some East European nations not being captive. Can you speak to that, and does it affect the outcome of the '76 election?
Before you do, we have a clip from that debate. We'll see that and be back to hear what our guests have to say. Here's a clip from that debate in 1976.
There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
I'm sorry, could I just follow? Did I understand you to say, sir, that the Russians are not using Eastern Europe as their own sphere of influence and occupying most of the countries there and making sure with their troops that it's a communist zone, whereas on our side of the line, the Italians and the French are still flirting with possibility?
I don't believe, Mr. Frankel, that the Yugoslavians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Romanians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Poles consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. Each of those countries is independent, autonomous. It has its own territorial integrity. And the United States does not concede that those countries are under the domination of the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, I visited Poland, Yugoslavia, and Romania to make certain that the people of those countries understood that the President of the United States and the people of the United States are dedicated to their independence, their autonomy, and their freedom.
Mr. Cannon.
President Ford essentially misspoke there. He meant to suggest that he did not accept Soviet domination of Europe, but that is not exactly what he said. And Ford can be a stubborn person sometimes, and in this case, when the staff came back to him afterward, and you can see the moderator of the program there trying to give President Ford a chance to correct himself on the second try, but President Ford thought he said that the Eastern European countries would not forever accept Soviet domination, but that's not what he said. And when his staff came to him later and said that you need to correct your statement, well, President Ford was very stubborn about it, as he can be sometime, and he refused for 3 days. Finally, after 3 days, he did correct it, and but by then it was too mistake. He had made a mistake. It was too late, and the damage was done. And that there was no question about it that that debate, which he was supposed to win on foreign policy, was a net loss for him.
Union City, New Jersey. Good evening. New Jersey? One more time for Union City. So we'll let Union City, New Jersey try back again. We in this series have been talking to teachers and students at schools that are named for the presidents that we're focusing on. And Donna Claren is a 5th grade teacher at the Gerald Ford Elementary School in Palm Desert, California. Good evening.
Hi, good evening.
Hi, can you tell us, other than the name of your school, how Gerald Ford is represented in your school?
Well, in many different ways. First of all, I think that there's a big distinction here because we're very fortunate to be named after a living past president. And I think that that makes our students and staff try harder in all that we do to make the President and Mrs. Ford very proud of us. And also, we're also very fortunate in that they're very active, visible, generous members of our community. And so we read about them and we hear about them, and he does come to visit the school. So
we have an article from the student paper here about a recent visit. Former President Ford has a different kind of school lunch. Tell us about this visit.
Yes, most recently last year, President and Mrs. Ford visited our school on their 50th wedding anniversary. And what they really did was they came to pick up their lunch. But it was a very different type of lunch, a school lunch. It had been made by my 5th grade students. President and Mrs. Ford joined us for the official premiere celebration of the Chefs Collaborative, which is a national adopt-a-school program in which chefs around the country go into classrooms with hands-on lessons about healthy eating, healthy planet, and sustainable cuisine from around the world. And President and Mrs. Ford's personal chef, Lorraine O'Neill, and chef owner of Native Foods, Tanya Petrovna, were teaching the first of an 8-class series that morning. And the cuisine of the day was Vietnamese, and my students under their tutorage made rice paper roll-ups with Vietnamese dipping sauce and salad for their lunch. And then they also made President and Mrs. Ford's lunch. And after the cooking class, President Ford spoke informally to our 4th and 5th grade students in the auditorium, and it was closed-circuited throughout the school, so the rest of the students could hear it also. He spoke about, I'm sorry?
Because the students have access, as you said, to a living president, are they much more attuned to current events and to recent history?
I think so. I think so. You know, whenever his name comes up in the school, or we read about it in the newspaper, or we just read the newspaper, matter of fact, you know, pretty fairly consistently in different classrooms. And when President Ford speaks, he usually speaks about the great people he had the pleasure to dine with. And, you know, our children always listen intently to that.
What subject do you teach?
Pardon?
What subject do you teach?
I teach, it's all subjects. It's a 5th grade classroom, so it's all subjects.
At that age, is there much interest in current events or history in general?
Yes, I think so. Specifically, you know, certain students obviously have a lot of knowledge, and then some students don't. I think it's really dependent also upon the family and whether or not they're involved in community affairs and world affairs at that time, too. But when we get into a discussion in the class, I find that the majority of my students have very intelligent questions and comments that go along with what's happening in the world and all over the world.
Donna Claren is a 5th grade teacher at the Gerald Ford Elementary School in Palm Desert, California. Thanks very much for a few minutes for us this evening.
Right. I was going to, if it's all right, could I say a few more things?
Very briefly.
Okay. I was going to say you had asked us also how we continue to teach world culture and world history. One of the things we're doing right now is we have a partnership with the U.S. Navy and the Bonhomme Richard, and we've been adopted by them. And so we also bring in Ford, you know, presidencies and all world history through that, because by teaching such rich history, and the Navy comes to visit us, and we've gone to the Bonhomme Richard also.
Donna Claren, thanks very much for your time this evening from the Gerald Ford School in Palm Desert, California. Albuquerque, good evening.
Yes, I have a question about the 1976 campaign. Years ago, I read a book by Malcolm McDougall, who I believe worked on the advertising for the Ford campaign, and he brings up 2 points about the campaign, 2 things that Ford had going against him, and I wanted to get some feedback on this. One was the way the names were printed on the ballot. It was Jimmy Carter as opposed to James Earl Carter, and it was Gerald Ford as opposed to Jerry Ford. The second point he brought up was about President Ford's ability on the podium, or inability, I should say, and that he would have to script his speeches because he didn't know when to pause for a laugh line or for an applause line, and he had to write the index cards of these speeches quite differently so he would know when to pause and flip to the next card. Do you know anything about that?
I don't think the latter part is true at all. President Ford had been speaking before audiences for 30 or 40 years at that point. But as I said before, I do not think that President Ford had mastered television. It was just not something he felt particularly comfortable with. He practiced, he did learn to do better, but it was not a natural medium for him. Some people are better on television than others, and he just happened to be one of the persons who was not that comfortable and at ease with television, and I think that was a handicap in his campaign.
Mr. Smith?
It's interesting. I have heard him say that if he could do one thing over in his education, it would have been public speaking. He would have done whatever it took to master public speaking. He certainly wouldn't claim to be a great communicator. I've also heard him say, though, also, it's interesting, the one person in American public life who he thinks is, hands down, the greatest communicator, the best speaker there is, someone he admires a great deal, and that's General Colin Powell.
Winnetka, California. Good evening.
Yes.
Yeah, California.
Thank you. It's a great series. I wanted to ask about the health care that the President and Mrs. Ford received, because I do know that he was a football player in his early life, and I was wondering how fit he was as President, because he was sometimes portrayed as being clumsy. And also I wanted to know about Mrs. Ford's health problems, because I do believe that she had some problems that eventually led to the creation of the Betty Ford Center.
That is correct. On the first part, President Ford was very fit. In fact, he was probably the most athletic of all the presidents. But because he slipped on a wet plane ramp in Austria, and there are these vivid pictures of him falling down these steps, he had acquired something of a reputation of what Mrs. Ford herself called his bumble and stumble habits. But it was he kept fit in the White House. He rode a bicycle. He did push-ups. He was and he swam. He had a swimming pool, and he swam regularly. Betty Ford had some problems. She had a problem of a pain in her neck when she was before he became vice president, in fact, and she began taking pills for it. And she also began nipping a little liquor to ease the pain. And over time, this did create problems. And after President Ford and Betty Ford, after they were out of office, the family did recognize her problem. She recognized her problem. She solved her problem. And not only that, but she, with the help of some of the family friends, created the Betty Ford Clinic, which has literally helped thousands of people who have become addicted to drugs and alcohol.
Richard Norton Smith, Betty Ford's presence is in virtually every one of the individual sections of these exhibits.
That's deliberate. We did not want to do what has perhaps traditionally been done. We didn't want to segregate the First Lady and have a room full of clothing, quite frankly, or White House parties. And where we did the traditional storyline, we wanted to do it in untraditional ways. So, for example, we have an area where you can punch up one of 6 different head of state visits and actually go inside the process. You know, it takes about 100 people 6 weeks just to put together a state dinner. Well, Mrs. Ford had her impress on each of those, personalizing them to reflect the tastes and the interests and the cultural interest in particular of her visitors. But, you know, she's much more than a White House hostess. She was, in many ways, a transitional figure. She is both a traditionalist, you know, a great wife and mother, and someone who took her hostessing very seriously. Here you can see, for example, an actual recreated place setting at one of the state dinners. I think that's for the big bicentennial dinner for Queen Elizabeth II, which, by the way, was also notorious when President Ford and the Queen took to the dance floor. The Marine Band, for God knows why, struck up The Lady as a Tramp. In any event, no international incident resulted, and relations were unruffled. But in addition to all of those traditional functions that she took very seriously, Mrs. Ford, of course, broke the mold in many ways. She was and remains a very outspoken woman. Her mother once said of her daughter, Betty, that she had, when she was born, she popped out of a bottle of champagne. She was a free spirit. She is a free spirit. She was very outspoken, obviously in terms of ERA. She lobbied hard for the passage of that amendment. But she was also very outspoken about her breast cancer surgery. And it is hard to believe, a generation later, that is something that women did not discuss, including with other women. And it was a bolt out of the blue. It came 18 days after the Nixon pardon, after the turmoil of that event. She went in for a normal checkup. And 2 days later, she had a mastectomy. And the decision was made from the beginning by both the President and First Lady that we were going to talk about this openly, candidly, and in hopes that other American women would be motivated to get checkups of their own. And in fact, Who knows how many lives have been saved as a result?
Our viewers just saw a portion of the 60 Minutes interview with Morley Safer that's part of the exhibit here at the museum. And Betty Ford, at the end of the 76 campaign, also read the concession speech for Gerald Ford. At the end of the campaign, he had virtually lost his voice, and this is the concession speech that Betty Ford read.
The President asked me to tell you that he telephoned President-elect Carter a short time ago and congratulated him on his victory. The President also wants to thank all those thousands of people who worked so hard on his behalf and the millions who supported him with their votes. It's been the greatest honor of my husband's life to have served his fellow Americans during two of the most difficult years in our history. The President urges all Americans to join him in giving your united support to President-elect Carter as he prepares to assume his new responsibilities.
Another of the numerous photographs of Betty Ford that are here in the museum. Oak Harbor, Washington. Good evening.
Good evening. I'm very proud that President Ford was a Navy veteran. In fact, I think all of our presidents benefit from active duty service in any of our military branches. But I've never heard President Ford talk about his 42 to 46 Navy experience. Can you shed any light on that?
Yes, it was a very essential part of his growing up, as a matter of fact. He had, by that time, of course, graduated from Michigan, graduated from Yale Law School, and was just getting started as an attorney, and was working in his law office on Pearl Harbor Day in 1941, when, in driving home, he heard on the car radio about the attack on Pearl Harbor. And he went home and told his mother and father that he was going to volunteer for the Navy the next day, and did. He went into the Navy as an ensign a few months later, and they assigned him as a, because of his athletic ability, they assigned him as an athletic officer for the Navy Flight Training School in North Carolina, and he was there for a short time, and then he wanted to be in action, like all young Americans of that day. They wanted to do their part, and so he wangled a way to get on a new carrier that was being built, the Monterey, and they sailed through the Panama Canal and got their planes on the West Coast, and soon were in action in the Pacific. And my recollection is in about 11 months, I believe, they won 12 battle stars. Ford was under attack by kamikaze planes and submarines. One torpedo just missed his ship and hit a cruiser nearby, and he survived the worst typhoon ever known in the Pacific. Barely escaped with his life. But he came home. The war had changed him. He had started out as rather an isolationist by nature, and the war made him realize that we were one world, and that was going to be his future. And his war service, in effect, led to his decision to run for Congress the first time.
In fact, Gerald Ford once described himself as a moderate in domestic affairs, a conservative in fiscal affairs, and a dyed-in-the-wool internationalist in foreign affairs. Madison, Wisconsin, good evening.
Good evening. I'm curious as to why President Ford decided to not select Nelson Rockefeller as his running mate in 1976, and if he would have defeated at the convention Ronald Reagan, and if with a Ford-Rockefeller ticket, if they could have been carrying New York against Jimmy Carter in November.
That's a good question. It's a very good question, and it's the political question of Ford's at the summer of '75. President Ford had started his campaign late, and he started with a Southern strategy, and he was persuaded by his advisors that he could not win the nomination because Ronald Reagan was already running against him. He was persuaded that he could not win the nomination if he kept Nelson Rockefeller on the ticket. And against his own wishes, he acceded to their demands, and Rockefeller, at his request, did take himself off the ticket. And President Ford has said several times later it was the biggest political mistake of his life, and he also said it was the most cowardly action of his life. It was one of the very few times that Ford did what somebody persuaded him to do rather than what he thought was right to do. And had he been, in my judgment, had he not done that, however, I do not think he would have been nominated. I think that his race against Ronald Reagan for the nomination was close as it was. I do not believe that he would have won the nomination. Had he been able to keep him on the ticket, he probably would have won the presidency. But my net judgment is that, yes, a Ford-Rockefeller ticket would probably have won the election, but it was not likely to be nominated.
Richard Norton Smith, how much input did Gerald Ford have in the design of this museum? How much is he involved in the day-to-day operations, and how often does he come?
He comes often. He's been here 7 or 8 times this year. He was here last night to kick off our annual, what we call Christmas on the Grand celebration, which has become a great community showcase really for all of West Michigan. He's a wonderful boss. Because he'll do anything you ask. He'll pick up the phone, ask people. We did earlier this year a Millennium Lecture Series. We had Alan Greenspan, and we had Justice John Paul Stevens, and Doris Kearns Goodwin. Billy Graham came to town. And over again, when we would raise these names, it would turn out that he had never asked them to do anything. And so, of course, when we did, they were only too willing to come to town and participate, really out of respect for him. He was a big help. We designed this museum. We basically blew up the old museum, which was fine for its time, but desperately outdated in terms of technology and in terms of the perspective of history. And so he would answer questions. I'll give you one specific example. The old museum made no mention of the assassination attempts, the 2 assassination attempts in 1975. But we had in our collection Squeaky Fromm's pistol. It had never been displayed. I think people felt perhaps it was too sensitive. And I went to the president and said, do you have any objection? He said, no, it's part of the story. And that's his attitude to everything. That clip that you saw, the Polish Gaff from the '76 debate, that plays over and over again in the exhibit here. And it's typical. The biggest recent addition that has his fingerprints is down in this lobby. And it is an amazing piece of American history. Now, what you're looking at right now is, in fact, Squeaky Fromm's gun. The letter next to that is a rather chilling document, a letter written to the president from his other would-be assassin, Sarah Jane Moore, who, among other things, apologizes for writing in pencil because in the jail where she's kept, they don't allow her anything else. But elsewhere in this museum, the biggest addition is a staircase.
We have a camera on the first floor that's going to get a shot of what you're talking about, so go right ahead.
Yeah, that staircase, an amazing piece of history. That staircase once led to the top of the embassy roof, the U.S. Embassy in what was Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City. And in the spring of 1975, that was the last means of escape for thousands of Vietnamese and Americans who were fleeing the onrushing communists as South Vietnam fell. And last year the embassy was torn down, and we wanted the staircase. I say we wanted. President Ford wanted the staircase. There were some, quite frankly, including friends of his, who said, why on earth would you want to remind people of that horrible tragedy in American history? And his response, utterly in character, is, no one knows better than I how humiliating it was to sit in the Oval Office of the White House and watch the United States, in effect, get kicked out of Southeast Asia after all the blood and sacrifice that had gone into that conflict. But the fact is, it's a part of our history. We must never forget it. To him, that staircase is as much a symbol of the human desire to be free as the great big piece of the Berlin Wall that sits out in front of our museum. And one other factor, he is very proud of the fact that over a great deal of opposition in Congress, and Jim can speak to this, he's written very eloquently about it, a lot of people wanted to simply pull the plug on the whole Vietnam era. And that included pulling the plug on hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese boat people. And Ford put together a crazy coalition of conscience, George Meany, the American Jewish Congress, a number of other organizations that shared his belief in the refugee tradition here. And they basically shamed the Congress into appropriating funds to bring initially about 120,000 Vietnamese refugees to this country. So earlier this year, we dedicated that ladder. He was here. We had hundreds of Vietnamese Americans here, and it was one of the most emotional ceremonies you could possibly imagine.
That's a picture of those final days in that staircase. Reno, Nevada, good evening.
Yes, good evening, gentlemen. Thanks for taking my call. A caller earlier stole my thunder a little bit regarding the Eastern European gaffe that he made during the 76 debate. But I also wanted to ask, with that mistake he made during the debate with his statement, and also how he was so satirized on Saturday Night Live and even spoofed in one of the Pink Panther movies, and during the fall of Saigon when his Secretary of Defense, as Bob Woodward recently in his book Shadow has revealed that his Secretary of Defense was directly disobeying his orders during the fall of Saigon. Did Ford come across to the country as someone who was in the wrong place at the wrong time? He was not really qualified for the job, and could this have led to his not getting elected in the election? And thank you for your time.
To take that in several parts, I think that at first President Ford did have some difficulty in establishing himself as the new president. There had been never a president chosen who got into office this way, and there were a lot of people who felt that he doesn't deserve the office. He had that to overcome. He had to overcome a White House that was occupied by Nixon people, and one of the mistakes that President Ford probably made was that he tilted toward continuing the Nixon policies and the Nixon people in the White House and in the cabinet probably longer than he should have. He should have, in retrospect, it's clear to say it would have been better to make a more clean break more quickly with Nixon than he did. He did. The Saturday Night Live is an interesting case, and I don't have any doubt in my mind, but that created an impression of bungling and stumbling that was unfair to the president. But nevertheless, presidents are the creatures of perception more than they are the creature of the facts and what they do.
About 20 minutes in our focus tonight on our 38th president. Springfield, New Jersey, the class is active tonight. Good evening.
Hi, my name is Chris Melendez, and I wanted to know, how did President Ford handle the economic situation that the country was facing when he first entered into office?
He got some bad. The answer to how he handled the economic situation, it was an economic summit conference just a very few days after he took office, which had been already planned, and he felt it was important to continue it. So he did have it, and to a man, including John Kenneth Galbraith, and to every economist there, from Galbraith to Alan Greenspan, said the problem is inflation. So he set out to solve the problem with inflation, and he proposed, among other things, a tax cut. Well, it was a matter of weeks later when suddenly the economists came back and said, no, Mr. President, it isn't inflation, it's unemployment. We're having a recession. It's a very serious crisis. So he had to turn 180 degrees to address that problem. Among other things that President Ford did, which is still, he set up a group in the White House, the Economic Policy Board, which is in one form or another pretty well still used to address questions of economics. It was headed by Bill Simon and Bill Seidman, and had Arthur Burns was a member in effect, and John Dunlop, the Secretary of Labor. A very high-quality group, and they were the persons who advised President Ford on his economic policies, and they, with Alan Greenspan, were the persons who pointed the way out of this recession. And it basically was not a popular policy, but it was to hold down government spending and let the economy come back on its own, and in time it did.
Houston, good evening.
Yes, good evening. I'd like to ask just what effect did your guests think that the Helsinki Accords had on Mr. Ford's crazy statement there in the presidential debate that Eastern Europe was not dominated by Soviets.
I don't think Helsinki had a direct connection on that. I think that in that case, in the desire to make his point on that debate, President Ford very simply misspoke and made a mistake. I think Helsinki was a very different matter, and Helsinki was a most serious effort on his part, not only to open the path to democracy in Eastern Europe, but there were very important other considerations there: ease of communication, travel, and the continuation, rather, of the reduction of nuclear arms, which was very important, came out of that Helsinki conference and treaty.
Lowell, Michigan. Good evening.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Cannon and Mr. Smith, for being here in our community. My question is regarding the Mayaguez incident, and I was wondering if you could fill us in a little bit. I lived through that time, and I do recall almost a surprise that we had a successful military operation. So if you could comment on that again, and again, Mr. Smith in particular. Thank you so much for being our
Richard Norton Smith.
Well, you have to remember all of this happened in the aftermath of the fall of Saigon, and American self-confidence was at an all-time low. It wasn't only confidence in the presidency, but the nation was not feeling particularly good about itself. And what happened was that the rogue government in Cambodia, Khmer Rouge, the most murderous, barbarous regime of modern times, they took an American ship, the Mayaguez, and took it captive, took its crew off the ship. This went on for several days. Jim probably can put the chronology together better than I can, but there was a very dramatic scene one night at a state dinner. I believe it was for the visiting Prime Minister of Holland. And in fact, to give you the personal element of diplomacy, he apparently was quite annoyed because President Ford kept checking out for some reason, and of course he wasn't telling him what he was doing. Well, what he was doing was, there was a rolling meeting of his foreign policy advisors. They were getting intelligence about the whereabouts of the ship, the whereabouts of the crew. They were considering taking military action, and indeed they did. They bombed the harbor, and eventually the crew was released. And it was almost a mirror image of the pardon. Gerald Ford's popularity soared 15, 20 points overnight. And it was, again, it was that sort of shot of a national adrenaline almost after the humiliation that had taken place in Saigon.
Part of the exhibit is the results of that polling pre and post Mayaguez.
Yeah, 12-point surge. And we have in our foreign policy gallery, we have the bell from the ship, and of course earlier you saw the ship's wheel.
It's here in the Oval Office replica. Telford, Pennsylvania. Good evening. Pennsylvania. Telford, one more time. Let's try next. Bountiful, Utah. Good evening.
Hello?
Yes, go right ahead.
I was going to ask about the Mayaguez, but it's already been answered. I'd like to know now, what do you think would have been the consequences of Ford would have been elected in '76? I think the country would have been a lot better off.
The first consequence, if he had been elected, I think, was that the budget would have been balanced about 20 years sooner. In 1976, President Ford proposed a plan that would have reduced spending and increased revenues to the point where we could have balanced the budget, possibly in 4 years, possibly a little longer. He felt very strongly that if he were elected on his own, that he would have a lot more weight in Congress in pushing through his programs for a return to a balanced budget. So I think that among other consequences, if he had been elected, would have been that our national deficit would have been about a fifth of what it is now.
New York City, good evening.
Yes, good evening, gentlemen. I was wondering if you would comment on something I had heard a couple of years back, that most of the military mines and the machinery that had led to our victory in the Gulf War had actually been put in place by President Ford.
That is absolutely correct. In fact, Colin Powell said publicly soon after the successful Gulf War that the weapons that won that war were commissioned, in effect, during the Ford administration. There's obviously a long lead time between a decision to buy a weapon and to put it in action, but Colin Powell himself said that we won that war with weapons ordered by President Ford.
Atlanta, good evening.
Good evening. I want to thank you for the outstanding series. My name is Vince Smith, and I wanted to ask Mr. Smith how the museum went about getting the ladder from the American embassy in Saigon. There has to be a wonderful story about that occurrence.
There is a wonderful story. I'm not sure I can tell it to you. Let me see. Let me do my best. 2.5 years ago, as I indicated earlier, we rededicated this place. We redid the whole museum. And we were very honored to have Secretary of State Madeleine Albright come here as the representative of the Clinton White House. And she took part in a very special conference with 4 or 5 former Secretaries of State, National Security Advisors, on the 50th anniversary of the Marshall Plan. And it was the first time she had met President Ford, and they had lunch, and they hit it off, as they say, swimmingly, and have stayed in touch ever since, and certainly share an internationalist viewpoint. And at that time, the Clinton administration, among others, was very interested in getting a chemical weapons treaty through the Congress. And it just so happened President Bush was also here for the rededication. So let's just say that President Ford and President Bush, who happened to strongly support the treaty anyway, were more than willing to make some timely phone calls to their fellow Republicans on Capitol Hill. And in due course, the treaty passed. And in further course, the Saigon staircase came to the Ford Museum.
Next call is from Barstow, California.
Hello, my name's James Van Busker, and I'm a teacher. I use your C-SPAN in the classroom. Very good program, by the way. I just love it. I was wondering, I was at the Gerald Ford Museum about 20 years ago, and I've noticed that watching tonight there are so many changes. What prompted this?
2 things, really. The passage of time. It gives us a whole new kind of technology to tell the story. But the story itself evolves. It isn't that the facts change, although frankly during that 20 years, researchers over in Ann Arbor have been digging into the 20 million pages of material, much of which was not available for scholarly interpretation 20 years ago. But the fact is that intervening events, for example, we were talking about the Helsinki Accord. I think any serious historian today tends to regard the Helsinki Accord as a significant milestone on the road to the end of the Cold War. The pardon might be seen in a different light. There's all sorts of events that, you know, history is fluid. And with the passage of time, we have additional perspective. And that's between the additional perspective that we have and the technology that we wanted to have. And frankly, we also are very, very blessed because President Ford is very generous. He's raised most of the money for the renovation of this museum. It was all privately funded. There wasn't any taxpayer money involved. We have a very active private foundation which puts about $500,000 every year into this institution. And so it all came together, and 2.5 years ago we were able to redo the entire place. And you're right, it's a very different kind of museum, and frankly it's quite different from any of the other presidential libraries.
Richard Norton Smith, we've been inside all of this evening, but outside of here, just on the corner of this museum, is the place that the Fords have decided will be their final resting place. Can you tell us what arrangements have been made?
Well, the arrangements, as you can imagine, that's rather personal, and it tends to be held rather closely by the family and by the military that is engaged in the planning. But it's certainly true that the Fords have always regarded Grand Rapids as home. From the very beginning, when this, the president was offered a site outside of Grand Rapids, and he was very grateful, but he said he really wanted this museum to be downtown where it could in fact help spark the renewal of the city. And from the very beginning, it was always planned, although frankly it's not been announced until fairly recently, that the President and Mrs. Ford would rest here on the grounds overlooking the Grand River, and that is the plan. Next up is Cleveland, Ohio. Good evening.
Good evening, and thank you for taking my call. My name is Chuck Raley. I wanted to make a comment about what wonderful treasures these presidential libraries and sites are throughout the country. About 6 years ago, I happened to be in Independence, Missouri, and had some time to kill, and I went over to visit the Harry Truman Presidential Library and Museum, and I was immediately just fascinated by the amount of information that I learned about that period of United States history that was on display there as you learn more about the Harry Truman administration. I made it a point then to try to visit presidential sites throughout the country, and I've been very fortunate to have visited all of the modern-day presidential libraries throughout the country, and in some cases more than once, visiting 2 or 3 times because you learn more and more each time. And I just wanted to say, in College Station, for example, I went there when they had the presidential papers program going on while developing the George Bush site. And while I was there, I believe they had it in what was once a former bowling alley, where they were creating or storing all these papers in preparation for building the museum. And I went there, and interestingly enough, they allowed me into that former bowling alley and gave me a tour of this huge number of files, and we went into a vault, and I could see up close and personal many of the artifacts that later landed in the Bush Museum in College Station. And much to my delight, someone there had kept my name. And lo and behold, when the Presidential Museum in College Station opened, I received an invitation to attend. And I was so thrilled that I went to College Station, and I saw many of the presidents come there, and I was there for opening day, and it just made me feel so much a part of America. And the patriotism of that day, and I saw many of the presidents there, and I just want to say to the American people, these presidential sites are gems to American history, and everyone should be encouraged to participate in seeing these throughout the country. And I thank C-SPAN again, and I just wanted to make that comment. I enjoy this program, and I've enjoyed learning about America and the presidents of the United States.
Thank you very much. Eureka, California, good evening.
Thank you for taking my call, C-SPAN. As a young person, during the appointment process of Mr. Ford, I remember him being under the microscope of many heavy political players of the time. And could you please tell me some of those names who were in objection to the appointment of Mr. Ford at that time? Thank you again.
You mean during the confirmation of President Ford? The fact, it was a rigorous examination of him. The committee put forth a major effort to find out everything they could possibly find out about him. And in addition, President Ford told his staff, look, I have nothing to hide. Open everything up. And he did open up all his files, all his records, everything. They investigated him down to his elementary school and his college, his high school football, everything. And there was some opposition initially to him, but once he answered all their questions, that opposition diminished, and he was confirmed handily by the House and handily by the Senate. In fact, it would, in an electoral college, it would have been an overwhelming landslide by which he was confirmed.
We had a call earlier about the gold helmet that is just over the right shoulder of James Cannon. We found out during our break that is an award from the AMVETS. It's the Gold Helmet Award for Gerald Ford's dedication to country in time of war and peace. Trinidad, Colorado, good evening. Trinidad, are you with us? We lost the last call. Let me close by asking you both about a line that's in your book. It's also in one of the panels here at the museum. at the museum. It's this, that Gerald Ford came to the presidency with the values of his boyhood: tell the truth, work hard, and come to dinner on time.
That is still absolutely true of President Ford. It was a childhood motto, and he still lives that way. He tells the truth, whatever there is. He tells the truth. He has worked hard all his life and still does, and he is punctual to the minute.
A last word from Richard Norton Smith.
I couldn't improve on that except to say this. He hasn't changed. Jim is absolutely right. He'll never retire. And the fact that those qualities perhaps were not as recognized, were not as embraced, were not deemed as politically successful as they might have been in an earlier era tells us less about him than it does about our own political culture.
Richard Norton Smith is director of the Gerald Ford Museum, and James Cannon, the author of Time and Chance, Gerald Ford's Appointment with History, a second book in the offing. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Lou.
I'd like to remind you, if you'd like to learn more about our American Presidents series, we have a website that you can go to. It's AmericanPresidents.org. You'll find all about the series and the scheduling for it. And speaking of that scheduling, this program is going to re-air this Friday evening, the 26th, at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Then on Friday, December 3rd at 9 a.m., we'll be in Plains, Georgia, for the program on the presidency and life of Jimmy Carter. And again, a reminder that C-SPAN in the Classroom, if you're an educator and would like to get more information about this series, 202-628, that's 626-4858. Again, 202-626-4858 for our educators. And that's a program from the Gerald Ford Museum in Grand Rapids. Thank you very much for being with us.